Our next speakers, we have joining us from the World Bank, Florina Pirlea, who is a statistician and focuses on data communication at the World Development Indicators database. And before joining the World Bank, she worked at the International Monetary Fund in the statistics department, so a wealth of background knowledge there. And Divyanshi Wadhwa is a junior data scientist, also working on the World Development Indicators database at the World Bank. Ladies, I know you're going to tell me about the story of the Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the most recent iteration on 2020. So over to you, Anna, take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. We, together with my colleague Divyanshi, we are very happy for this opportunity to present a few highlights from the 2020 Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. So this is the cover. Next slide. Great. As many of you know, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, are a set of 17 goals that all UN member states have agreed to work to achieve by 2030. The SDGs aim to be relevant for all countries at all income levels and to promote prosperity while protecting the environment. The goal of the Sdg Atlas is to expand understanding of the goals for a broad audience and to show how we can weave data in the fabric of development to support progress of the SDG agenda. You can access the Atlas at this URL on the screen, or simply by typing Sdg Atlas into your search engine, which I highly encourage you to do. Next slide, please. Before talking about the 2020 Atlas, a very quick walk down memory lane for a bit of context. The goal of the Atlas is to communicate complex knowledge on international development in an accessible way. The bank has published atlases for a long time. Here in the 1966 edition, you can see hand-drawn maps with only two indicators, GDP per capita and population. But the Atlas has evolved over the years. Next slide. Next slide. These are just a few selected examples. And next slide to come to the present. And 50 years later, it has evolved even more. It did a somersault when the Sustainable Development Goals were introduced. The World Bank was actively engaged in the UN process of how to measure the SDGs. From the beginning, we also started to think about how to communicate the goals in a more inclusive manner. So both the 2017 and the 2018 edition of the Atlas were very collaborative publications. And they brought together insights in a variety of data sources from within the World Bank, as well as from many other institutions and researchers. The 2018 edition was also the first fully open code publication of the bank. Next slide. In 2020, the Atlas was published exclusively online for the first time. In this edition, we introduced interactive storytelling and scrollytelling. And we also introduced new types of visuals. And here we were inspired by the type of data journalism produced by news outlets like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Because this particular visualization style with interactive scrollytelling, which we will show in a moment, lends itself better to exploring a specific topic, we decided that for each goal, the chapter will focus on a few selected targets because the SDGs have many, many targets. And so we decided to go into more depth about some of them. And because this was 2020, we also had to find ways to include emerging COVID-19 data and relevant information, both in the analysis and the visuals. On the technical side, for development, we use JavaScript libraries such as React MD3, For analysis, we use statistical tools like RNS data, and for coordination, GitHub and ArchEML. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of some of the charts and graphics used in the Atlas, but we also have an interactive demonstration. My colleague Divyanshi will show some examples of how we chose to present different SDGs and different targets using this approach. Next slide. There was an additional video slide. I can present this, and perhaps we can come back to the video slide.
Thank you, Florina. I'll give a couple of examples from the Atlas and talk about our approach towards them. First, let me talk about SDG 4, which focuses on quality education. A measure of quality education developed by the UIS and World Bank called learning poverty considers children learning poor if by the end of primary school they are unable to read and understand a simple text. Imagine that we place all children from low and middle income countries who are expected to be at the end of primary school in this rectangle. The ones in the green area are not learning poor, while the ones in the orange area are learning poor. You will see that over half of the children in low and middle income countries are learning poor. The learning poor can be broken down into two groups: children who are in school but cannot read at a minimum proficiency level, shown in yellow in this visualization, which make up about 40% of all children, and children who are out of school, shown in red, another 10% of all children. This clearly shows that of the learning poor, the vast majority are in school, implying that school enrollment alone is insufficient. These figures differ greatly by region. You will see that in 4 regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Middle East and North Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean, more than half of the children are learning poor. In fact, in Sub-Saharan Africa, 9 in 10 children are learning poor, equivalent to more than 100 million children. We started working on this edition of the Atlas before the pandemic. Since then, we've had to reconsider several chapters to make information relevant, but also driven by data. This was a unique challenge to us as at that time especially, there was not much data to shed light on the impact of the pandemic on most SDGs. So we had to be a bit creative. In case of SDG 4, our colleagues in the education team performed some analysis which showed that school closures combined with low effectiveness in mitigating the crisis could increase global learning poverty by 10 percentage points, from 53% to 63%. These analyses help us put the pre-pandemic statistics into context of the current times. To further understand the impact of school closure, we looked back into other times when schools were suddenly closed due to a major shock. During the 2014 Ebola outbreak, the government of Sierra Leone closed all schools for the entire 2014-15 academic year. A recent study examining the impact of the school closures on young girls of ages 12 to 17 found large adverse effects for girls in the villages most affected by the outbreak. School enrollment dropped by more than 15 percentage points since the outbreak, pregnancy rates doubled, numeracy fell by 7 percentage points, and literacy was halved. Other than this SDG in the Atlas, we also talk about how COVID has impacted across several other chapters. For example, global poverty went up for the first time in almost 25 years. Hunger was also affected with some case studies showcased on increase in food insecurity, and so on. I will now move on to another SDG goal, which is on energy, where we take a unique approach to examine access to electricity around the world. This is SDG 7. Let's see how the world looks from space at night. From this visual, we can compare lights in one location to another place with a similar population density. To the left, you will see a 150-kilometer circle around Washington, D.C., where I am based right now, and to the right, it's for Katakwi, Uganda. Now, according to official estimates, 100% of the people who have access to electricity and 43% of the people in Uganda. But this visual is even starker where the area around Katakwi looks almost entirely dark in comparison to Washington, D.C. So this gives us added insights into what access to electricity looks like even within countries. This globe is also interactive. You can move the globe and click on a map to choose another location. For example, I just clicked on Waco in United States. And the comparison region for that city is Hamhung in Korea. And you can look at access to electricity as a comparison in two cities with similar population density. Now I'll pass it back to Florina to talk about one of the environmental SDGs, which focuses on oceans.
Thank you. After this presentation, we wanted to give yet another example. The Sustainable Development Goals focus on many areas of the environment, including land and oceans, but also climate change and sustainable consumption. So we also wanted to briefly highlight Chapter 14, which focuses on the conservation and sustainable use of oceans. In this edition of the Atlas, specifically for SDG 14, we used a set of projection maps which are better suited for showing oceans. Specifically, this on the screen is a GOODE, G-O-O-D-E, Homolocene projection. So we used this type of map because we wanted to highlight critical issues affecting oceans. Such as the threats faced by coral reefs, which here on this map you can see in light blue. Next slide. The location of the so-called dead zones, which you can see in orange. These are areas of the ocean that do not have sufficient oxygen to support marine life. Next slide. We also use this type of map to show the impact of overfishing. Next slide. The impact of shipping. Next slide. As well as the overall impact of human activities. And next slide. Also, in this chapter, like in all chapters, we wanted to make the pages and the visualizations as mobile friendly as possible. So our talented developer team made many of the visuals look nice on mobile, and I certainly hope you will give it a try on all platforms. And now back to Divyanshi.
Thanks, Florina. Can we go to the next slide, please? We mentioned in the beginning that the Atlas draws on a lot of knowledge from subject matters within the World Bank and outside of it. It is a very, very collaborative approach, and we utilize resources not just within the bank, but many other institutions around the world. The chapters and the analysis rely on data sets published by national and international agencies, as well as a wide range of academic institutions and researchers. Next slide, please. As you all know, the SDG canvas is very large and covers a wide area of development. And while working on this edition of the Atlas, we learned a lot about development at large. And we also really appreciate that people enjoy the simple way of storytelling for the SDGs, and we are really quite heartened by it. So I'll focus on some takeaways about the medium we used for this Atlas rather than the substance. This process of building the Atlas web publication was new to us and taught us a lot. It was the first time we only had an online version and no static or print version of the Atlas. For the most part, this decision was taken because of COVID, because with COVID came working from home, and access to information was almost exclusively from digital sources, especially for the audience of the Atlas. So it made sense for us not to have a print version. although we do acknowledge that there are some benefits of having a PDF version, even when print isn't an option, such as low connectivity of internet in some parts of the world. Lastly, I wanted to say that as for having a web publication, one of the biggest benefits is being able to keep the data pretty much current till the day of going live, unlike print where any changes have to stop weeks in advance. It's also easier to update the stories later in case there are any changes in the data. And it is also much easier to harness the power of online communications and utilize social media for it. Our aim with each atlas is to bring development data and its trends and complexities to the public in a way that is accessible and compelling. And we hope we were able to do this with the 2020 edition by weaving visuals closely together with the narrative through storytelling. We would be happy to take any questions at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, ladies. That was a very comprehensive, and I thank you so much for bearing with us. I know we had a couple of technical hitches. Question that has come in from our audience is, how did you choose which targets to focus on for each of the Sustainable Development Goals stories? Perhaps you could tell us just a little bit about that.
I can take this one. The main goal of the Atlas is to best explain the SDGs in a way that would be useful and interesting to both experts and the wider public. And so in the Atlas, we wanted to highlight only different ways of looking at the SDGs, for example, showing trends, comparisons, but also explaining methodologies. In Chapter 2, for example, we explore the concept of food insecurity, showed how experienced food insecurity varies across geographic regions. But then we also looked in detail at the most recent survey for Guinea as an example, and how households in that country responded to the survey of the questions. But we did this, we took a different approach for each chapter. While one explained the indicator at detail in case of SDG 2, in case of SDG 9, which focuses on infrastructure and industry, we took a detailed look at one of the SDG goals that focuses on rural access index, as it's one of the more newly developed ones, which measures the proportion of rural population who live within 2 kilometers of a road that is accessible year-round. And so we took this approach in order to highlight different ways in which we can evaluate SDGs and understand not just the patterns, but also methodologies, and introduce the audience to new ideas and new indicators.
So we have another question. If you can keep your answer as short as possible, I know it's difficult. What was the process for developing each chapter? I think you've already touched on a lot of that.
Hi. Yes. So just very briefly, the SDGs have there are 17 SDGs, and so we have 17 chapters. And each of these chapters, for each of them, we worked with experts inside the bank, but we were also informed by outside research. And so each chapter had 1 or 2 authors and experts that we work with, also an editor, also data visualization developer. And so it was a very intensive process, very collaborative for each chapter. And everyone pitches in with ideas. And at the end, the second part of the work was to give it a common voice. So we edited each other's work, we commented on each other's approaches. So we wanted, the final product to speak for the bank and for our take on the SDG and what we want to share with the audience, so that everyone finds something useful in it. And I hope you do, and I hope they do.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Our audience is saying it was a great presentation. So no more questions, just lots of compliments. But of course, I will remind the audience that you can interact with the speakers directly using swap cards. So don't forget to do that if you've got more in-depth questions you want to get into. Thank you very much, ladies.